Hello and welcome everybody to the third installment of our Approaching the Past workshop series in Toronto, bringing together historians, educators, and museum professionals to talk about local histories in Toronto. Now you see me looking off the camera here. That's because I'm looking at Kate, the organizer of one of the organizers of the workshop series, and she's actually going to be asking me a series of questions about Toronto and the First World War that we've collected from educators in the city, asking them what they want to know about the city of Toronto during the First World War and what kind of challenges they encounter in the classroom trying to teach this material to students. So my name is Mary Chaktsiris, and I'm here to talk about Toronto and the First World War in my capacity as a historian of the city of Toronto and of the First World War. So that being said, I'll hand it over to Kate off camera to ask the first question.
Our first question comes from Joanna, an elementary history teacher, and she wants to know, how did the war affect daily life in the city?
This is a really good question, and the war affected daily life in the city in a great many ways. Starting kind of big, the war affected life in the city through big-scale ideas concerning rationing. For example, there was a coal shortage in the winter of 1917. Recruitment and conscription activities really affected daily life in the city. There were victory bond drives going down, parades down Queen's Park, big meetings in various public spaces in the city. But I think the way that I want to go about answering Joanna's specific question about daily life in the city is to talk about the schools and the experiences of students in the schools in their relation to war. Now, this is a subject that's been written about very extensively by historians, both within Canada and in the British Empire, and it's been very clearly proven that there were connections between militarism and education starting in the late 19th century and really kind of reaching a crescendo in the years right before the Great War. And what that means is that war and the fighting of war as something that was the duty of citizens was present in the curriculum in Ontario in the decades before the First World War. So not only were ideas of war circulating in the curriculum, young men and young boys of school age were also participating in military activities in the schools. So there's the cadet movement and there's the Boy Scouts, but within the schools, in the curriculum, during gym, for example, or physical recreation, boys would be engaging in physical drill, in military drilling. And the reasons why young men were engaging in military drilling is because it was believed by educators and social reformers to be a way to instill discipline, duty, and obedience in Canadian citizens. And so I think what we can talk about in terms of the schools in the years during the war is a very militarized climate where students are familiar with and engaging in ideas of war as an act of citizenship. And how that goes or translates into the experiences of the schools during the war is that many school-age children who met the requirements to enlist did so. There's been great work done by Tim Cook, who explains actually that there were many underage students who enlisted in the armed forces. And so many schools in Toronto, if you're lucky enough to have your own archive, or you may have a memorial plaque that lists the names of school-age of students that participated in the war. If you have access to any kinds of old yearbooks, then you may there too find names of students from those particular schools who went to war. Now, many of us are in newer schools who don't necessarily have lineages that stretch the decades back, well, century back now to the Great War. But I think communicating to students the ways in which other students of their own age in Toronto enlisted for war will help them to understand the prevalence of the war and the war effort in the daily lives of these young Torontonians who were experiencing a home front climate that was by 1915, 1916, and 1917 certainly very much geared towards the increasing costs of war. And so just one way to take a look at that is to look at the schools as places that were militarized, which is, I think, very different than the climate that we're used to today. And I know teaching at Queen's University, many students there are surprised by the amount of students that enlisted that they share with me just like them. And so to try to connect students with a war that seems perhaps a bit far away, by explaining to them that, students or of their own age would have enlisted for war can open up a conversation about why or when or the particular circumstances that may have encouraged or motivated these young men to enlist for war.
That's great. How did the city change, Alexandra wants to know, during the 4 years of war to adapt to the war effort?
Again, the city changed a great deal over the 4 years of war, and the change is really in relation to the changes in the war effort, and by changes I mean increasing demands of the war effort. Now, the war that Toronto entered in August 1914 started to look like a very different war when it didn't end that Christmas. Certainly by 1915, after the Battle of Ypres, the reality of the physical costs of the war were becoming increasingly obvious to Torontonians. As we move through to 1916, we see returning veterans, and we see an increasing difficulty in recruiting men for war. And by 1917, of course, you know that we have the conscription crisis, and by 1918, we have our first conscripts being sent overseas, and also the ultimate armistice on the 11th day of the 11th hour in November 1918. Now, the reason why I give you this kind of large chart over these 4 years is because the ways that the city changed over the war, and very specifically the way the city spaces were used during the war, changed in relation to the demands of the war effort. So, for example, the CNE is a really particularly interesting case to look at during the First World War. And by the CNE, of course, I mean the Canadian National Exhibition and the grounds down by the waterfront in the downtown. Now, what's particularly interesting about that space is that it actually had three purposes during the First World War. It was used as a military camp. It was used as a place of exhibition, of course, for the exhibition that we all know happens at the end of August. And it was also a place of internment for enemy aliens. And so there was actually a small jail cell there where interned men were kept before they were either released or sent to different internment camps in different parts of the province. Now, what's interesting about the CNE as this kind of space with three purposes, that is to say a place of exhibition, place of military training, and a place of internment, is that it kind of brings together all these different facets of the war effort in one space and illustrates the ways in which they didn't quite fit together comfortably. So, for example, we have, after the outbreak of 1914, almost immediately a very strong military presence on the CNE grounds after the exhibition in late August of 1914. And this continued presence of a military camp on the CNE grounds continues straight throughout the war, except for those summer months when the troops were actually expected to vacate for the annual exhibition to occur. And so what's interesting about those yearly exhibitions, when you have a space that's a military camp being emptied out for the invitation of spectators from across really the continent. I mean, people came in to see the CNE from all over Ontario and certainly from certain states in the United States. And so the CNE became actually an exhibition not only of agriculture and technological progress, but an exhibition of Canada and Toronto's commitment to the war effort. And so what we actually have in the exhibition during those 4 war years is a kind of recruitment exercise at the CNE. We have trenches there that are dug for spectators to see what they look like. We have officers there recruiting men for service. We have military dignitaries visiting, like Sam Hughes, coming and showing publicly Toronto's support for the war at the CNE. Now, what's interesting and not really known about as well is that while this is all going on, while there's the exhibition and while there's the military camp, there's also a small internment receiving station, is what it's called, at Stanley Barracks. And that is where enemy aliens who were arrested are placed as the officials decide what to do with them. And so we have at the Archives of Ontario and the City of Toronto Archives these kind of very haunting photos of men staring out at the camera from behind a barbed wire fence. And it's interesting, other than kind of the scrawl in the corner that indicates that it's an internment camp, it's very startling to look at these kinds of images, this image of these men behind a barbed wire fence, and to place it alongside the kind of more joyful images of celebration that are coming out of the CNE, and to try to understand the ways in which in Toronto there were a great many experiences of the war. It wasn't all just this kind of jubilous celebration of war and empire. There were also these kinds of other more difficult stories to tell, such as those men who were interned at the CNE grounds. Now, these are difficult stories to bring into the classroom, mostly because it's difficult to find the primary sources to bring them in. The photographs at the CNE, from the CNE at the City of Toronto Archives of Ontario, are a wonderful place to start and to get students thinking about the ways in which it wasn't only one story of Toronto during the war. There were all these other kinds of more complicated community stories to talk about, and the CNE grounds is just one way that I'm expressing to you the ways in which these narratives or these experiences existed in the same place, but at the same time in kind of a tension with one another.
That links into our next question from Katie, a secondary school history teacher, who wants to know how we can uncover the stories of multi-ethnic communities in Toronto during the war.
Yes, this question of other stories or other communities during the war is a really interesting one. And I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting is because we are left today very much with a strong singular narrative of the First World War. And it's one that most of us are very familiar with, and that is, of course, the Great War as a kind of nation-building exercise. Now, of course, the big hole in that story, or the big issue that always needs to be addressed, is conscription. You know, how did different parts of Canada come to terms with conscription? And of course, we know there were great divides between French and English Canada, and between rural and urban parts of Ontario. But I think when we actually look closer at Toronto as a city at war, we see the ways in which different communities dealt with the war in different ways. And one particular community I'm going to talk about today, well, it's a couple of communities actually, but it's those Torontonians who were labeled by the outbreak of war as enemy aliens. And this idea of an enemy alien is very interesting because it's really, at the outbreak of war, a legal definition. An enemy alien is someone who is defined as a foreign national or someone originating from a country that the empire is now at war with. And of course, as the empire goes to war, the British Empire, so too does Canada. The enemies of empire are, of course, in this war rhetoric, the enemies of Canada, enemies of empire, the enemy of Canada. But the interesting question to ask about the city during the war is, who is an enemy? Who is an enemy? How do we define an enemy? How are Torontonians talking about who they are fighting? And Torontonians, if you look at the press, really are talking about ideas of enemies at home. And these enemies at home are Torontonians principally of German or Austro-Hungarian nationalities. And that covers a variety of different nationalities. But in terms of how they're being identified by the government and by the authorities who are arresting or surveilling these people, they are either Germans or Austro-Hungarians. And because of that affiliation, they are people who need to be watched. These are people that are believed to be suspicious characters. And it's interesting because this idea of enemy also changes over time. And so the question is not only who was defined as an enemy, because like I said, in a certain sense, it's a legal definition, but it's also socially defined, because the secondary question is, well, okay, how are they defined, but then who actually is an enemy, or how are these enemies being reported to authorities? And that is where we see Torontonians really looking very suspiciously at their neighbors. So I've come across many, many letters at the Library and Archives Canada of Torontonians writing to authorities in the city, complaining about their neighbors, saying, hey, so-and-so down the street, he looks like a German and he talks like a German, and I really think that you need to go and investigate him. Has he taken his undertaking? And an undertaking was a legal agreement between a citizen of Toronto and the government that they would report every once in a while for duty. It's almost like parole to a certain extent. So they would agree with the authorities to come and see them at a agreed upon time to ensure that they're not participating in any kind of unpatriotic activity. And so what's interesting about these letters that I've seen about Torontonians reporting on other Torontonians is the kind of superficial nature by which individuals are identified as enemy aliens by others in the city. The big kind of indicators of a so-called enemy alien are the way someone may speak, the way someone may dress, any kind of indication that they are foreigners not born in Canada was often enough for a letter to be written to the authorities asking them to follow up with a certain individual. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about this idea of an enemy at home, and a way that we can talk about enemies with students, is to look at the ways in which enemies are defined in the propaganda. So we have wonderful digitized war poster collections in a variety of different spaces. The Canadian War Museum has a wonderful digitized collection. So too does the Archives of Ontario. And if you look through these posters, and you can ask students to identify things like, who is the enemy, or why are people fighting? And if we can get a sense of these kind of wider ideas of why the war effort is being fought, of course understanding these are highly censored images, and then we place this idea of enemies on top of these kinds of contested experiences of enemy aliens in the city of Toronto, I think what we start to see is a disconnect between these kinds of more superficial ideas of enemies and the actual people that are being surveilled or being seen as suspicious in the city of Toronto.
You spoke a little bit about digitization, and what we hear from educators over and over again is the impossibility or the challenge of accessing local sources. Students have difficulties connecting to a war that was fought 100 years ago, according to some educators who contacted us. And they really are looking for tips to engage students in learning about World War I in a local way. What would you say to educators who are experiencing those challenges?
Well, I think I would say that they are real challenges. It is really a challenge to get students interacting with primary sources in meaningful ways in the classroom. And the reason why I think it's so challenging has to do with issues of access. Some of us are lucky enough to be at schools that have, their own kind of small collections of primary sources or yearbooks that stretch back to the period of the Great War. But most of us are not quite that lucky. And so taking students on trips to archives or bringing the archives to the students becomes something that's very difficult unless we really utilize the digital sources that are available to us through the internet. And I'm telling you, they are absolutely wonderful. Like I said, all the war posters are digitized. Many national newspapers have been fully digitized, like the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. And I think what's interesting about using newspapers as a source is actually to encourage students to be able to find their own primary sources online. And it's something that actually is quite simple once you take the time to actually sit down and use that search engine or use that database search, which of course are useful skills in research at all levels. And so I think what we can actually do is look to digital sources as a way to have students interact with primary sources online in a way that they can't necessarily in person. So newspapers are one really great way. I mentioned too the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, which are fully digitized. The other resources that have wonderful primary sources that are digitized are many of the local Toronto archives. The City of Toronto Archives has wonderful images that I encourage you and your students to explore. And of course, teaching students how to read photographs as historical documents is very interesting as well. To encourage students to look at photographs and analyze them and take them as seriously as we do textual documents is, I think, something that students find, or I at least have found in my experience, students find very encouraging to encourage them to look at visual sources as useful entries into talking about the past. Really encourages students to explore avenues of historical research and encourages students who may not be necessarily interested in textual documents to look at the past in a different way. And so I think those digital sources at the City of Toronto Archives and the Archives of Ontario are really, really good entry points for you and your students to talk about primary sources in the classroom. And I think it's as simple as there's so many out there that if you had students in a lab and they each had their own computer, they could all find a different source to analyze or analyze them in groups. It's absolutely phenomenal, the kinds of sources that are out there. But again, I think it's not only about asking teachers or encouraging teachers to go out and find all of these primary sources. It's actually about getting students in front of those computers and getting them to engage in digital sources by finding them on their own. And this helps with students to develop general research skills as well. Now, the other thing that I think we can do to connect students to past historical events, this war, for example, that's almost a century old now, is to explore the ways in which the war really is still very much a hot topic. Talk to students about these events as events that are not necessarily finished. And, the book isn't closed. The chapters haven't all been written. Canadians are still very much talking about and debating the Great War. And I think the best example of this is just the outpouring of publications and newspaper articles, magazine articles about Canada and the Great War as we reach its centenary celebrations or anniversary. And so I think asking students to look at contemporary newspapers and contemporary editorials, contemporary opinion pieces, government websites, look at Veterans Affairs, look at, D&D, and see what the Canadian government or different historical associations are saying about the Great War, and encourage students to try to make connections or perhaps look for similarities and differences between the ways in which different groups are talking about the Great War. Because let me tell you, Canadians are talking about the Great War in a variety of different ways. Yes, there may be a kind of a singular narrative, a nation-building narrative, but we see in many places, and especially in opinion pieces, ways in which Canadians are questioning or uncomfortable or uncertain about what the war means to us today. And this idea of what the Great War means to Torontonians today and to Canadians today is still very much a rigorous debate. And so I think it's as simple as asking students, do you care about this war? Why or why not? If you don't care, well, all these other people do, and why is that? Why do they care? So I think it's about engaging students to understand the ways in which this war surrounds them politically and socially, but also physically in different buildings and different memorials. For example, the Peace Tower at our Parliament buildings in Ottawa was constructed as a memorial to the soldiers of the First World War. And so when we look at the ways in which the Great War surrounds us in kind of uncommon ways, or ways that we often look over, we need to encourage students to look at the world around them with a historical lens so that they can start to question the ways in which a certain statue or a poem or a plaque may actually be talking about wider processes than just something that's been, forgotten and that we've moved on from. I think in many ways, Torontonians and Canadians in general have not moved on from the First World War. We are still talking about it a lot. And so I think engaging students in that debate and engaging them in that narrative and encouraging them to help construct their own ideas and own narratives of what Toronto was like during the war, and encouraging them to pursue their own ideas of what they find interesting within that historical kind of question is the way in which we can encourage students to look at history in the past as something that is not necessarily finished in that sense. It's something that we are still talking about and interested in. And I'm telling you the best way to do that is with digital sources.
Thanks so much for all of your great tips today and all your strategies. We're so happy to have had you.
Well, thanks for having me.